And it looks like we are live. Well, hello again, and welcome to another live stream here on Adam's Music Box. Just to sort of give you an update on this channel, which still feels very new and fresh, like a puppy in a window and all that. I think that on Saturdays and Sundays, I'm going to do live streams, and then I'll save the pre-recorded short videos that talk about a concept or an artist or a band or a couple of bands. I'll keep those on the weekdays. Let me know what you think whenever you see this. Helpful and fun feedback is always a happy thing to have. So today I was thinking about musical retirement because a lot of the great bands of that AOR era, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they're still on the road, but they're starting to sue each other. Some are approaching retirement, some are threatening retirement, some are threatening to come out of retirement. So what does it all mean to you and me, the listener? And this got me thinking. Look at the previous generation of artists, the classic pop era, so they call it. People of that Sinatra, Dean Martin, Andy Williams style, and of those generations. And I was thinking, when did they retire? And so I looked into it. And Frank Sinatra, he retired twice. He retired once in the early 70s, but that retirement was very, very brief, luckily for Sinatra fans such as myself, and he continued to tour, albeit with a slightly reduced schedule, up until the early 90s. He was in his late 70s when he gave his final performance, and he died in the late 90s in 1997, I think it was, at the age of 82. Let me just look that up, when Frank Sinatra died. Because I think it was, I remember watching the funeral on live TV, and no, it was 1998 when he died, and he was, in fact, 82 years old. Then I looked at Dean Martin. He retired in early 1995, died later that year, and he was in his 70s. Andy Williams continued to perform into his 80s before dying at the age of 84. Tony Bennett, of all of those classic pop singers, probably the most longevity. He retired in 2001 in 2021 rather, in his 90s, and died in 2023 at the age of 96. So what does this show? Well, this shows that the musicians of the classic pop era, they continue to perform into their old age. And let's look at Sammy Davis here. I'm just going to look up his age and his retirement. So he died in 1990 at the age of 64. He died relatively young, unfortunately. His final performance was in the late 1980s. And so he still continued to perform very close till the end of his life. And then when you get into the classical world, it's very common for conductors to conduct until their dying day. Leopold Stokowski, a very underrated and misrepresented conductor in the media. Let me just riff on that for a while. Stokowski was a true innovator, and he was someone who had all of the great qualities of a conductor that I really like. He was not afraid of tempo rubato, meaning a flexible tempo. He wasn't afraid to add his own arrangements or changements, as his contemporary Wilhelm Mengelberg would say. He really was an expert at getting a wonderful sound out of orchestras, whether it was the highly refined portamento, free bowing sound of the strings in the Philadelphia Orchestra, or with the American Youth Orchestra, or any of the other smaller big orchestras that he worked with around the world. He really had an ability to get the best out of musicians without losing that Stokowski sound, a sound which really, it had a focus on precision in terms of the playing. He really required a high quality of performance in his musicians. The portamento was something that he more or less left in Philadelphia in terms of that string sound, but the free bowing was something that he brought with him to many other orchestras. The free bowing is when the string players don't have to bow in unison, unison, and it creates a very rich type of sound. And that stayed with Philadelphia even under his successor, Eugene Ormandy, even though sadly for me anyway, the Portamento did not. But he conducted into a very, very old age. I think that his final performances were around 1977. And let's just look and see how old he was then, because he is a conductor remembered for a great deal of longevity. He was in his 90s. He died at the age of 95, and he never really retired. Herbert von Karajan retired until conducted rather into a very old age, and only retired in the months before his death. He was 81 and he died in 1989. So again, the classical world tends to have a lot of longevity too. In the jazz world, we see Roy Haynes, who's still active, I believe, one of the great drummers of all time. Let's look him up and see what it says. So he was born in 1925, which makes him 99 years old today. And he continues to play. I don't know if he's playing quite as much now as he did a few years ago, but just a few years back when he was in his 80s, I saw him and he was wonderful. Never lost a step. B.B. King played into his old age. So it isn't uncommon for musicians across various genres to play into their old age. Herbie Hancock, of course, is still going strong. Let's look up how old he is. And I'm not doing this as a vanity project. Oh, look how old someone is. What I'm trying to establish is that music is really something where you really only retire if you want to. Herbie's 84, doesn't look it, looks much younger, plays really well. And so this gets us into the music of that sort of rock and roll era when rock and roll matured. So obviously we have early rock and roll, the Chuck Berrys of the world, the Little Richards, the Elvises, etc. But let's look at this sort of golden age of the sort of rock era that sort of went into the AOR era from the late 60s through the 80s. So sort of traditional, sort of loud, fun, modern late 60s rock up through the end of AOR. And bands of this generation are still touring up a storm. I've been reading a lot of reviews and watching a lot of videos from the three-legged tour that's going on between Steve Miller, so Steve Miller Band formed in the Bay Area, Journey, another Bay Area band, and Def Leppard from Sheffield, England, home of Joe Cocker, one of my favorites. And a lot of people are commenting, well, should these guys retire because they've been at it for a long time? And it got me thinking, were people telling Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Andy Williams to retire? Were people telling Stokowski or Karajan to retire? And here's where it gets interesting. Rock and roll was sold to the world when it was invented as a youthful and rebellious music. Obviously, European classical music, while there's many rebels within that musical movement, people like Wagner, for example, people like Scriabin in Russia, the music itself has always been the music of the art world rather than the music of the pop world. That's not to say that it didn't, beginning in the 19th century, gain a lot of widespread commercial popularity. It most certainly did. But it's still considered art music, and the term art music then was transmutated into the term classical music. When you look at jazz music, jazz has had a profound influence on pop music, but jazz itself has hardly ever been pop music per se. It again has been somewhat confined to this world of art music, but always flirting on the sidelines of pop music. Blues, arguably the mother of all modern pop musics. And many blues musicians have played into their very late years. I gave the example earlier of B.B. King as one of them. But what about rock and roll? Well, rock and roll was not only sold to the world as a rebellious style of music, but also as a style of music that was specifically connected with youth. By By the 80s, though, we learned that rock and roll musicians had a lot of longevity. There were bands formed in the 60s that many didn't expect to last for more than a few years. Some would have said not even for a few months, and they remained big into the 80s and continued to tour since then. And again, the bands I mentioned, Journey started in sort of the early mid 70s. They're going strong, not with all of their original members, but they could with their classic lineup if they wanted to, if they could just stop suing one another. I mean, even the guys in it, Neil Schon and Jonathan Cain, they're in the current lineup, and they're from one of the classic lineups. And I think they've just reached a settlement, but they're happy on stage. Def Leppard has most of their original guys. Steve Miller has always been somewhat of a rotating band, but Steve is still going strong. Then we can look at another big summer tour, now that summer's almost over, as Jim Morrison would say. And you've got Sammy Hagar with Michael Anthony doing what I still consider to be a Van Halen tribute show. It's called The Best of All Worlds, but it's basically the closest thing to an Eddie tribute that we're going to get. Be happy. I've seen this footage. I think it's been a really good tour. And Sammy is in his 70s too, although you would not know it from looking at him. So he was born in 47, which makes him currently 76, and his birthday will be in October because he has his big bash at the Cabo Wabo around that time. And who else had big tours this summer? Let's look it up. And we'll do what we've been doing and looking at the various ages. So AC/DC have been on tour, No Spring Chickens. Deep Purple is about to go on tour towards the end of the year. Alice Cooper is about to go on tour. Bruce Springsteen's been on tour. The Eagles have been on tour. Who else? Did I say Stevie Nicks? Yep, she's been out there. I think Heart were on tour. I think they may have had to cancel part of it. Aerosmith were going to tour, but they did take a retirement because of problems, sort of vocal problems in the band and that sort of thing. But the point is, these bands may seem like they're overstaying their welcome to some. Now, others might say that it's wonderful. There's an audience for it, which there undoubtedly is, and let them perform. Some of these bands and singers still perform really, really well. Some are a bit past their prime. Some, Motley Crue, are quite a bit past their prime. But hey, if people want to see it, why not? And that is what sort of inspired me to compare and contrast what these bands are doing versus what the prior generations, that classic pop generation, were doing. And the answer might be surprising. If people like Sammy Hagar and the guys in Journey, at least the two guys of the classic lineup, Neil and Jonathan, and Def Leppard and all of these guys, if they're in their late 60s and 70s, Roger Waters, who comparatively recently finished a tour, is in his 80s. The Rolling Stones are still going strong. They're in their 80s. We're looking at something that's relatively comparable to what the Sinatra generation did, to what many of the great classical musicians of the 20th century did, what many of the great jazz and blues musicians did or are still doing. And of course, there is the fact that jazz and blues doesn't pay as well as pop and rock. And rock, certainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and in just about into the early 2000s, rock and roll was one of the, if not the domineering movements within that broad pop genre. And so you could make an argument that some of these musicians do it out of choice, but the great classical conductors were generally always compensated. Well, Karajan was very financially successful. Stokowski, because of all of the things he recorded, his work in film, he was very successful. And these men recorded into their old age. Karl Böhm, another conductor who recorded many, many albums from both the pre-war and into the stereo era. He died in the 80s. He did well. So I don't think that you can say it's the financial motive alone, although with this economy, I certainly am not going to discount it. That's certainly part of it. And so why then do a lot of these musicians get a lot of calls to retire? Because if you heard Frank Sinatra sing in the late 80s and 90s, yes, he was still good, but he wasn't what he was. And the same with a lot of these classic pop singers. A Dean Martin show in the 1980s wasn't as good as a Dean Martin show even in the early 70s, and he was no spring chicken then. Um, and the same with conductors. Conductors, even though they're not physically playing an instrument, as they get older, they're not able to get from the orchestra exactly what they could when they were younger. So there's the financial motive, there's the fact that when you're older in music, you're generally not quite as good as when you're younger. You do hit a peak at some point. But I do think that it's unfair to say that a lot of these rockers are sort of milking the cash cow or that they're pathetic, because they're really not much older as they are performing and nearing a retirement, as were musicians from other generations and in other genres. And I think that this could be even at a time when rock and roll, just in my lifetime alone, has gone from something that when someone said rock and roll, it still meant rebellion, it still meant youth culture, it still meant something contemporary. And now when someone says rock and roll, people tend to think of dad music, they call it, or dinosaur music, or that music that isn't quite as popular among the youngsters as is Taylor Swift or Drake or other sort of dance and hip hop derived genres. But nevertheless, it still carries with it that kind of stigma that, oh, this is young people music. You shouldn't really be touring in your 60s, 70s, let alone your 80s, even though musicians from other genres have and still continue to do that. And that got me thinking about what happens when today's young musicians become old. Will there still be demand for Taylor Swift when she's 64, as Ringo might say? And so we can look at Madonna, for instance. She's still out there doing her stuff, and she is, let's find out, her current age. You can all send these people a birthday card based on the copious research I'm doing for you. Let's see here. So Madonna she's 66. And she's on tour and she's wearing the seductive clothing and doing all of that. And I'm sure some people out there will make an argument, oh, maybe it's easier for a male to age on stage than a female. And maybe there's something to that. But Madonna's sure out there trying to prove them wrong. And if you're measuring it by the fact that she can still get people to sit down at her shows, she is defying that stereotype because she's very successful. So will Taylor Swift do that in her 60s? Will Drake do that in his? We'll have to see. Hip hop so far has aged well. The golden age of hip hop still really isn't as old as some of these AOR and rock groups that we're talking about. And someone, I've got a comment, Madonna's problem is her health. And I'm not going to ask which part of that, but yeah. She's still making money though, but yeah, maybe. So yeah, the hip hop guys seem to be aging gracefully because hip hop has always been a movement that is both musical and cultural. And because of that, a lot of them go into acting. A lot of hip hop artists go into branding, which kind of gives you longevity. And look at Jimmy Buffett. He got a lot of longevity out of his career because, yeah, his music was really popular and it was very unique. It was both sort of tropical in theme about the beach, but also firmly rooted in the country and Western tradition. But he branded himself and was one of the first musicians of his generation, certainly, to really brand himself super successfully with restaurants and drinks and clothes and a lifestyle. The Parrot Heads. The Deadheads, of course, had a lifestyle, but their whole thing was not capitalizing on it, where Jimmy Buffett did capitalize on it. And Sammy Hagar, who I mentioned earlier, his wife took him in the 90s to a Jimmy Buffett show, which sort of gave him the confidence in the firm sort of hard rocking world, as opposed to sort of the country pop world that Buffett inhabited. It gave him that confidence to merchandise himself, to sell his tequilas, and now he's selling rums, and he owns restaurants, and he sells all sorts of merch, and he uses that so that he can take his bands on tour in an era where the music business isn't what it was. So I think that what he's done personally is great. Not a lot of people know this, but all of his restaurants, I think some or all of the proceeds, I think certainly all from the airport restaurants, are given to local children's hospitals and children's charities. And the profits he makes from his tequila businesses and his rum businesses, he reinvests that in the music business. So it's not, the Sammy Hagar tour sponsored by Pfizer or Toyota or anything else like that. Aerosmith, yeah, we talked about them because Steven Tyler, he threw in the towel. His voice gave out. That's not stopping the Motley Crue guys. but the point, but just to recap for new people who might be joining just now, the age that these rockers from that 60s, 70s era, 80s era are in isn't any older really than when the Dean Martins, the Frank Sinatras, the Andy Williams, the Tony Bennett's were, in his case, even older when they retired. So yeah, I definitely think there's some prejudice against rock, which leads me into the second sort of, it's kind of a rock show today, the second sort of rock topic that I've been thinking about and wanted to get into. And this is, again, it has to do with longevity, and it's all about bands that had second lives. And it's got me thinking, which band has had the most successful second life? Now, in the rock world, it's usually when a lead singer leaves. But not always. I mean, UFO, they changed guitar players, and I mean, some people are very loyal to the Michael Schenker era as opposed to the Paul Chapman era. I think both were really, really good. But usually it's when a band loses a lead singer. Just going to read another comment here. We've got, I love my rockers. I want to see them continue, but I don't want to see them go out bad. Yeah, I agree. I say do it so long as you can just about pull it off. And again, you're never going to be as good usually in your 60s or 70s as in your 30s, 40s, 50s. But if you can still entertain a crowd, and if people still keep coming back to see you, I agree with the comment there. I think it's Dan who said that. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And so, yeah, UFO changed guitarists, and I think they were just as good before and after Michael Schenker. People can let me know what they think, but which band that changed a vocalist was most successful? Well, let's look at Jefferson Starship, which kind of changed a lot of vocalists, because you had Grace Slick and you had Paul, and then Grace left, and people thought, well, she was the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, which then became Jefferson Starship. I sound like Homer Simpson now. But Mickey Thomas, when he was brought into that band at the end of the 70s, he really gave it a shot in the arm, because he brought a much more sort of powerful vocal style as opposed to a more laid back vocal style, reinvented the band. Then Grace Slick came back into it, and they did some great things. And I mean, Mickey Thomas is really, if we're talking about these great AOR singers, people talk about Lou Gramm from Foreigner, Steve Perry, of course, from Journey. People talk about both of the singers in Survivor. Survivor, one of these AOR bands with two singers. But Mickey Thomas, such a good singer, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves. And I was just coming to what Dan has said. Yeah, Van Halen, one of my all-time favorite bands. And again, because of the very different styles of David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar, there's a bit of a war between, it's a friendly war between fans. I love both eras. Sammy was obviously the more gifted musician and more technical singer. David Lee Roth, the unparalleled showman, who arguably helped get the band off the ground because he knew how to market Eddie Van Halen, where Eddie didn't know how to market Eddie. And so that was, for a while, a marriage made in heaven before they decided to hate each other and all of that. So they were one of them. AC/DC, Bon Scott to Brian Johnson, you could say equally successful with both, and they had a lot of super memorable hits on both sides of that equation. When you've got Highway to Hell and TNT on one side, and you've got You Shook Me All Night Long, Back in Black for those about to rock on the other, you can say that there was different vocal styles, but it worked so well. Genesis. You could put them on that list. And they had, you could argue the styles changed, but I think that style changed more with the era than anything else, because when Phil Collins became the lead singer in 75, they were still doing that same sort of long form progressive music. And it was only when sort of the 80s came knocking on the door that they decided to make slightly more FM radio friendly music, let's call it that. And I agree, yeah, Genesis is one of the greatest groups of all time. The Doobie Brothers, it's not so much that they lost permanently, but when Michael McDonald came into that group, he did change the sound. And yet there was a consistency in terms of the high level of musicianship, their ability to improvise on solos, their ability to create multiple forms of sort of soul rock fusion, which is really in many ways what the Doobie Brothers were, with certainly in the early days a bit of country thrown into it. So they were able to be survivors when a very different kind of voice was brought into a band. I'll try to think of some others that changed, because I'm sure that there are some that I'm forgetting. There are Fleetwood Mac. How can we forget Fleetwood Mac? Because Fleetwood Mac changed its musicians so many times. Yeah, Doobie Brothers, great. In Fleetwood Mac, there was obviously the initial era where they were a blues band, blues rock band with Peter Green and Jeremy Spencer, and then Danny Kerwin, and then you had, what was it, the Bill Welch era. Christine McVie came into it, and then they said, right, we're gonna bring in Lindsay and we're gonna bring in Stevie. And that's when the band was already almost 10 years old by then, but most people out there probably discovered Fleetwood Mac in 75 when the quintessential lineup came into it. And then you can look at the Eagles, how their sound became more rocky and less country when Joe Walsh came into it and brought more of a hard rocking, heavy soloing guitar into it. And yeah, Stevie, just reading the comments here, Stevie Nicks as a solo artist, really great. Different than Fleetwood Mac, but obviously her voice so consistent, and she collaborated with a lot of great people. Tom Petty was a guest on her first solo album. She did stuff with Don Henley. Really good stuff. So I mean, I'm sure I'm forgetting some of the others, some of the other bands that had a big shift in either a major instrumentalist or a lead singer. But those are definitely the ones that come to mind. And so, just because these streams are just about sort of whatever's on my mind, I want to talk about the Chapman stick. Now, the Chapman stick is one of the more recent developments in terms of musical instruments, because you don't get a brand new musical instrument every day. And it came out in the mid 70s, and it was the invention of a jazz guitarist called Emmett Chapman, who had been experimenting with some 9-string guitars. And he thought, well, why don't I develop a guitar-derived instrument that can play both chords, bass lines, and melody lines, and where you use it with both hands. And the Chapman stick is an instrument that I still think sounds so futuristic, and maybe that's because not a lot of people used it. The first person who really used it to great effect was the great bassist, one of the best bass players of all time, Alphonso Johnson. And he's probably best known as one of the great bass players in Weather Report. Look at all the bass players that went in and out of that band. Miroslav Vitus, Alphonso Johnson, Jaco Pastorius. But his solo albums that he released in the mid-70s, all of which are amazing, and I think most of which are now on Spotify, you should check those out because they are really good, and there's a lot of Chapman stick on them. And then the man who probably is most famous of all for playing the Chapman stick is Tony Levin. He played it on Peter Gabriel's albums, he played it live with Peter, he played it with King Crimson, he played it with, he's one of the most sought after session people ever, and he played the stick a lot. Nick Beggs, he's probably most well known for being in one of the lineups of a sort of new wave band from the 80s called Kajagoogoo. not a fan of the name, but they actually, if you like that genre, and even if you don't, they actually had some really good music. And he's played live with people like Steve Hackett. He does his own stuff. Really, really good. Yeah, Too Shy. That was a Kajagoogoo song. Thanks, Dan, in the chat. Chatting up the storm. I love it. And so, yeah, the stick is an instrument that I think it should have been bigger than it was. I don't mean in size, but I mean in terms of how many people played it. And I'm not sure why other people didn't take it up. The technique itself is definitely something that you need to learn. But if you're a good guitarist or bass player, it shouldn't be that much of a challenge to learn, so long as you're relatively proficient. But not many people took that plunge that Alfonso and Tony did. And in so doing, they really became some of the most famous of all the stickmen. So definitely check out Alfonso Johnson's stuff. Tony Lemon's stuff is already probably on the stuff that you're watching. One band this is in the chat. One band that I believe was underrated was Toto. Yeah, absolutely. We actually talked about Toto on this channel before, but to recap, one of the things I think that made Toto so great was that all of these guys had trial by musical fire. They were session musicians, and that meant that they needed to play across all sorts of genres with little rehearsal, and they were expected to be perfect. I mean, sort of boot camp. If you're in the military, that is the equivalent of being a session musician. And that's why that's one of the reasons that they were so good. But one of the other things that I think really made Toto special is that they showed that being session musician wasn't all skill and no heart, because they were great songwriters. I mean, Africa alone is one of the finest songs ever written, and they had so many. Hold Back, Rosanna, Hold the Line, Georgie Porgy. I mean, the list could go on. They were good writers, and they sold loads of albums. And you don't sell loads of albums in a world dominated by pop music, as opposed to the sort of more jazzy or avant-garde side of things, if you're not good songwriters. So I think what Toto showed is that if you were a session guy, you could become a superstar, even if vocals wasn't your main thing, because obviously in the 60s you had Glenn Campbell, who transitioned from session guy to total superstar. But I think it's different when you're a keyboard player or a drummer, because obviously Jeff Porcaro and his brothers, such important parts of that band. And so they really sort of hit a home run for session musicians. Everything, maybe I can be rich and famous as opposed to just moderately rich. And so, I mean, session musicians, obviously, the 70s and 80s was a really golden era, especially for that generation of session musicians, which is something that things like MIDI, things like auto-tune, things like the readily available tools like Pro Tools that you can use to record at home, that has really made the world of session musicians contract. There's still great session musicians out there, but there are fewer than there used to be, fewer gigs between them than there used to be. And as a result, many studios are closing. People can record their stuff themselves, and people at various parts of the world can punch in, if you will. They can send their stems over. And again, there's pros and cons. A good thing about that is that it's more democratic and that more people have an opportunity to get more exposure. The downside is that the quality control that went into the recording sessions at a big studio that had microphones and had reverb units and instruments and consoles that you just couldn't find overnight, even with an unlimited budget, that's going. And a lot of big studios are closing, which I think is a pretty disappointing thing. Question in the chat from Dan. I have a question. Do you know if Madonna wrote her song when she first came out because she had so many great hits? I think that she definitely wrote her lyrics. I think that she may have had some help on the music, but let me just look up her first album here and see, because that is a good question. I mean, I know she wrote the lyrics, but let's check out some of her hit songs in terms of who actually wrote the music. So let's look at her breakout album, Like a Virgin from 1984, and let's look at the writing credits. So yeah, it looks like she collaborated on the tracks. So she definitely wrote the lyrics, and she co-wrote all of the songs with various other musicians. Now, Rogers, of course, famously of Chic, produced that album. So, yeah, I mean, I would consider her a songwriter, but not necessarily a fully fledged musician who could write an entire song without help. Because when I'm looking here through the writing credits on her major hits, she definitely had help co writing. And like I said, to bring us sort of circle back, as the kids say, to bring us back to where we all began, yeah, she is still going. So um, that's all that I had to say for today. But I'll be back tomorrow. And thanks, Dan, for the chats. Remember to tell your friends and everyone out there, like and subscribe to this relatively new channel. We're in our growth stages, as they would say on Wall Street. So loving and sharing is caring, and all that sound like Ringo now. So like, subscribe. We'll see you next time. I'll do live streams usually around this time. Don't hold me to it, on Saturdays and Sundays, and then the little short videos that I put out during the week. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in, and to Dan for all your great chats. We'll see all of you next time. Take care.